There we go. We got about... Oh, hi. Sorry, we're running a little bit late. Excuse me a sec. Hey, Bob, make fast. Sorry, man. Welcome to Culture in Decline. My name is Peter Joseph. You know, this show is designed for those that want to be a little more skeptical about society, because perhaps you're like me, and as you stumble around this experiment we call global society, you can't help but feel an increasing sense of unease, perhaps even frustration, with respect to how we, the human family, have chosen to organize ourselves on this little planet. The late astronomer and well-known advocate of scientific thought, Carl Sagan, his famed PBS series Cosmos, once invited the question: if we were visited by a superior species from another part of the galaxy, and were forced to explain to them our stewardship of our planet, not to mention the state of human affairs today, would we be proud of what we described? How would we frame our explanation of how almost half of the world, over 3 billion people, are either barely surviving in abject poverty and sickness, or are simply dying off unnecessarily at a rate of about one person every couple of seconds, all occurring in the wake of an advanced technological reality where we could easily feed, clothe, and house every family on Earth in a respectable standard of living? How would we frame the global warfare, 230 million killed by their fellow man in the past 100 years alone? Based on what? Meaningless territoriality, resources, dogmatic, obsolete ideologies? Again, this all occurring in the shadows of a looming scientific recognition that we are indeed simply one family, sharing one household, bound by the exact same laws of nature, and hence the same unifying operational ideology. How about our economic system? The bedrock of what defines our society, not to mention our dominant motivations. How would we explain the reality that rather than organizing ourselves efficiently as a single system to properly manage this household we share, we childishly divide and compete and exploit each other through an archaic, completely environmentally decoupled game? A game, by the way, which not only appears to perpetuate a vast spectrum of social atrocities, but now seems to be further destabilizing society, decreasing our public health. Sorry to say, as an individual, I really don't care what you believe, nor do I particularly respect it. Why? Because I don't really respect what I believe either. There's no evidence to show that any of the traditional values, establishments, or social structures, common practices we have today will be relevant tomorrow. The only thing that appears to stand the test of time is this very notion of change, the ever-evolving understanding of ourselves and the world we inhabit. Perhaps some might think that that's actually the definition of human intelligence. What do you think about that? Less about what we know, more about how vulnerable we are. So when you look out your window, ask yourself, do you see intelligence or do you see dogma? Do you see a culture listening and working to realign itself with the ever-emerging natural orders as they unfold? Or do you see desperately stubborn efforts by many, particularly those in positions of power, trying to keep everything the same to the detriment of the entire human experiment? You know, like you, I might be only one member of this family that is now 7 billion strong. And like most families, yeah, sometimes it's hard for us to agree. But sometimes things get so bad, we need serious intervention. The following series is that intervention in the hope to salvage what is clearly a culture in decline. It's an election year in the United States, and some may say it's an election year for the whole world. Still the dominant empire, the United States political system has spent roughly $25 billion in the past decade alone. An amount of money, if averaged and distributed annually, could house and feed every homeless person in America, effectively ending the epidemic. Perhaps like me, by the end of this program, you'll find that money will be better well spent. Be that as it may, the 2012 presidential election is gearing up to be one of the most expensive and ostensibly important elections of all time, given the ongoing debt crisis, the unemployment crisis, and the vast destabilization we see across society. However, I'm not particularly interested in the left or the right, or am I interested in any candidate's political merit? What I'm interested in is the entire idea of global democracy in the tradition as it exists and how it is blindly accepted by the vast majority of people on this planet as being the only option to satisfy their interests and create good well-being and hence societal management in its optimum state. That's what interests me. So, rather than debate about who should be the next president, why don't we step back and consider some broader issues, such as, I don't know, maybe why we even have a president to begin with? What is this, medieval feudalism? I thought the days of kings, dictators, and giving one person enormous power was coming to an end. Or, more generally, doesn't it seem a little absurd to claim a participatory democracy when the public itself actually has zero say when it comes to the actual decisions made by those elected? It's bad enough that those voted in have literally no legal responsibility to do anything they might have claimed on the campaign trail, but if you examine history, you will find the historical fact that the public good has always been secondary to other interests, mainly financial and business interests. Of course, this is common knowledge now, right? I mean, why did the US government, completely against all known public interest, allow the private banking system, a system which actually creates nothing, to be bailed out to the tune of $13 trillion?
You have a $14 million oceanfront home in Florida. You have a summer vacation home in Sun Valley, Idaho. You and your wife have an art collection filled with million-dollar paintings.
While the public was left out to dry with overflowing private debt, job losses, and a stagnating economy. You know, if we're going to persist with this silly little game we've concocted called the growth economy, where the movement of money defines everything, it might be a good idea to do the math regarding what might actually help this economic system operate at some passable level.
Therefore, if you raise taxes on the so-called rich, you're really raising taxes on the job creators. And if the goal is private sector growth, you got to recognize that the best way to create that growth is to leave capital in the treasuries of the job creators.
If that money spent on the bank bailout was spent on, say, relieving private household debt instead, while letting Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and all of the other technically meaningless, non-producing financial institutions experience the failure and bankruptcy they deserved, simultaneously nationalizing the entire U.S. banking system as a whole, the U.S. economy might have had a chance. Why? Because banks don't actually contribute anything. People with jobs do. You want growth in this type of system, you need jobs. You want jobs, you need demand, and demand requires people having free money to spend. So by helping the public debt burden, you would plant the true seeds of economic growth. Well, of course, as obvious as that may seem, many forget one thing. The bailout had nothing to do with helping the U.S. economy, nor does it or will it work to help any hurting, sovereign economy in the world. Why? Because we live in a plutocracy, not a democracy, and the only true power is actually behind the curtain, not in front. The financial and business powers not only own and control this country, they own and control the whole planet. And no, it's not a conspiracy, it's a value system disorder. As long as a dollar sign is associated with every blade of grass, every plot of land, every fleeting thought or invention, not to mention judging the merit of individuals for their right to life through labor, we should expect nothing less. Since the inception of the state itself, coupled with the underlying power of money as the ultimate driver of human decisions and hence persuasion, the true power has always been financial. And those little people you elect into office every couple of years, they have owners too. And don't you forget it. Democracy, is that something you believe in as it exists today in America?
Well, when you say as in believe in, does it exist like forest fires or God or the devil?
What is your opinion of the American democratic system as it exists?
It's broken. It's deeply, deeply broken.
Democracy goes, of course, to Greece, and it's the theory that the people own the government. And is it in practice happening in 2012 in this country? Not close. It's a corporatocracy.
So all of this considered, let's now think a little more accurately about this whole democracy deal. Since the tradition of our democracy has to do with representatives elected to apparently do our thinking for us, a critical question becomes, where do these people come from? Why are they the ones on your TV and not others? Did you decide that these people are the best choices to compete for such critical leadership? Or have you noticed that the most pronounced candidates, especially the presidential, sort of come out of nowhere and through the media are given credence merely by repetition of exposure? The term democracy comes from the Greek demos, which means people, and krates, which means rule. And so the people of a given society express their opinions through votes, and policy is created by the majority's interest. It appears the process was formalized in ancient Greece and has been adapting ever since. However, it didn't take long for a bit of cynicism to emerge with respect to the process itself, given the fact that the entire basis of the idea assumes that the voting public actually is educated enough to know what they're doing. Franklin D. Roosevelt once acutely stated, "Democracy cannot succeed unless those who express their choice are prepared to choose wisely. The real safeguard of democracy, therefore, is education." Winston Churchill, on the other hand, was a little less forgiving, stating, "The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter." And, of course, the infamous Mark Twain jumped to the inevitable punchline, stating, "If voting made any difference, they wouldn't let us do it." I would like you to ask yourself, if we were in the ruling class, the investment ownership class, to paraphrase Thorstein Veblen, and we wanted to preserve our interests against any interference, what would we do? Well, first we need to take the broadest possible view we can. We need to make sure the voting public is as uninformed as possible regarding relevant issues that might contradict our establishment's practices. Coupled with that, we also need to eliminate as much independent, logical, causal, scientific thought as possible. So, let's support an extremely underfunded, outdated, and deprived public educational system. A system focused on merely getting a person a job one day, not teach them how to critically and logically think. At the heart of democracy really is the basic assumption that the public is well educated about critical thought, they know how to think about things and evaluate, and therefore they can make proper decisions, right? What is your opinion on American education and hence its effect on the democratic process?
I think that, we have multiple problems in the education in America. One, I think we're dealing with the dumbing down of America.
And do you feel that this sort of poor educational system actually benefits the establishment?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Keep them stupid, keep them easily entertained. If they're uninformed, they can't fight back.
However, to further reinforce this, we also need to push and reward belief systems that support passive obedience. Belief systems and values that are stubborn, irrational, and promote closed thinking. Religion becomes super helpful in this circumstance.
Is it possible that religion is being politicized and that candidates are using it as a tool?
I believe that God created the universe.
And we're enjoined by Scripture and the Lord Jesus to oppose it with all our might.
Let us not pray that God is on our side in a war or any other time, but let us pray that we are on God's side.
May God bless the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
I thank the God who loves us, the God who gave us life, who gave us our being.
And so to every sailor, soldier, airman, and Marine who's involved in this mission, let me say, you're doing God's work.
If people are groomed to be obedient and follow blindly, they are ripe to extend that obedience to others who claim authority. Check. Next, it's critical we recognize a unique sociological characteristic of the human condition, something we will call herd psychology. This is the tendency for us humans when faced with mass appeal to often behave in extremely thoughtless and malleable ways. In the words of Charles Mackay, famed author of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, "Men, it has been said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one." However, this doesn't just apply to, say, a soccer riot. Such mob persuasion can be generated through simply shared cultural events. Remember September 11th? Talk about mass insanity. This event created an immediate crowd madness with fear and revenge. And it didn't take long for the U.S. government, and other governments in fact, to harness that madness and funnel support for draconian legislation and illegal invasions. However, this herd psychological tendency is not only very useful for implanting and guiding perceived issues of importance, it is also critical in setting rigid limits of debate, creating the tendency for those who begin to question beyond those limits to be ostracized and rejected by the herd itself. You know, if someone talks about a more equitable distribution of income in society,
all the growth that has occurred in our country over the last decade or more has gone to the upper 1-2%.
Fucking communists. If someone speculates about the obvious power manipulation and corruption, God damn it, I am so sick of these conspiracy theorists and their lies. The Federal Reserve does not collude for its own self-interest. And heaven forbid we get those do-gooders who want to actually apply modern scientific knowledge and improve society with it. Yeah, right. Feed, clothe, and house everybody on Earth with technology? Utopian jackasses. Remember, probably the greatest way to control human thought is to establish a deep fear of social rejection and associate that fear to culturally taboo subjects. So, that groundwork in motion, we now have to deal with the pesky problem that the public just might wise up enough and work to maneuver a person into political power that will cause us problems. Therefore, some more specific structural safeguards are in order. Basically, we need to make sure those unwanted candidates are unable to get anywhere near the major outlets for public digestion. And if they do, the practice is to treat them like freaks.
Are you suggesting that heroin and prostitution are an exercise of liberty?
What you're inferring is, you know what? If we legalized heroin tomorrow, everybody's going to use heroin. How many people here would use heroin if it was legal?
How do we do that? With money. And our corporate constituency has plenty. We just need to make sure the use of this money for political influence goes uninhibited. In a U.S. Supreme Court 1976 decision, the freedom for a candidate to use unlimited personal money for their campaign was deemed legal, equating spending money with the right of free speech, in fact. What this translates to, in effect, is the removal of any regulated fairness of expression, and hence whoever has the most money has the most resources and hence effect. Perfect. However, let's secure this a little bit farther. Let's also make sure that our corporations are given the legal right to promote our little puppets without limit. Luckily, in 2010, our pals again at the U.S. Supreme Court confirmed that the government may not restrict political spending by any corporation in candidate elections, as they are, once again, protected by the First Amendment. So now we can buy mad ad space to promote whoever we want as much as we want, drowning the opposition in the media. And double check. Okay, now those broad measures in place, it is still important to control the basic unfolding of the electoral process from start to finish. The best way to do this is to create a false duality, the illusion of competition between parties. We need a two-party system that constantly argues with each other in general, but still upholds the basic elitist policies we need to maintain our advantage. The beauty of this dominant two-party farce is that it not only gives the public the needed illusion of choice, it more importantly oppresses those upstart third parties. As we know, these annoying self-righteous third parties have been troublemakers from day one. The civil rights amendments, women's suffrage, broad worker rights, child labor laws, and other agitations for industry all came from these rising third parties historically, not from the dominant established group, us. So we need to be vigilant here. We need to get the public so used to this two-party dictatorship that they don't even mind if the two parties are given direct control over most of the electoral process itself. They need to have the power of organizing the rules of electoral redistricting, the primaries, the caucuses and debates, and of course we, the ruling class, will moderate their actions through lobbying, campaign contributions, exactly what the free market promises. the freedom to manipulate everything. So meet our friends, the Commission on Presidential Debates, or CPD. In 1988, the Democratic and Republican parties, or the Demo-Publicans as I like to call them, established the Commission on Presidential Debates. Posing as a nonpartisan institution, the CPD successfully took control of the most influential election event, the presidential debates. The CPD, which is a private corporation co-chaired by the former heads of the Republican and Democratic parties, decide through secret contracts who is going to participate in the debates and what is going to be talked about. So those pesky third parties, along with controversial ideas, can only come into play if the Demo-Publicans decide they can. I mean, really, can you imagine what would happen if those annoying social upstarts actually were able to go up against the trite, miserable logic and narrow subject matter typical of our rigged debates?
But for the nurse, the teacher, the police officer who, frankly, at the end of each month, they've got a little financial crisis going on. They're having to take out extra debt just to make their mortgage payments. We haven't been paying attention to them. And if you look at our tax policies, it's a classic example.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. President, but I couldn't agree more. However, don't you feel that the tax policies and other common acknowledgments about what is hurting the average American is actually quite benign when compared to the very foundation of our economic system? You know, making money out of debt, charging interest on it that doesn't exist, which means that there is always more outstanding debt than there is money to pay for it. Of course, that lends itself to more debt being created to cover it, and essentially failure and bankruptcy is inevitable. Not for the upper classes as much as the lower middle classes, of course. Why? Because the lower classes are the ones taking the loans for their home and their car, while the upper class are actually making interest income. Rather than paying interest, they actually make interest through their deposits and investments. Obviously, this secures a massive growing class divide structurally. Is that not something worth considering? No? Oh, and as a final point about the CPD, our corporations can now directly donate to them, hence the parties, imposing our financial influence and hence agenda even more, making another end run around that pesky legal legislation barring corporations from contributing directly to political campaigns. A beautiful end run. However, nothing's perfect and you can't be too careful, and sometimes good old-fashioned time-tested tactics are needed, and nothing is as old-fashioned as good old direct electoral fraud. So let's get some of our corporate buddies to build some voting machines with really terrible integrity and get them in as many critical spots as we can. Yeah, I know it's sloppy. It has already become public that the machines can be hacked remotely with about $10 in materials and an 8th grade science education. But since most Americans are completely distracted by their debt, lowering standard of living, and ongoing job losses, the liberal media falls on deaf ears. So, let's recap. Free-thinking people tend to recognize the need for ongoing adaptation and change, so we need to make sure education supports the existing tradition through mere rote learning, not critical, logical thought. Next, we establish clear limits of debate in the culture, and make sure those who go beyond the pale are shut down by endless ridicule and debasement. Then we need to harness the herd psychology and guide it through our media to either identify with the issues we need in the forefront or distract them outright. As far as large-scale influence, we need to have the freedom to do whatever we want and to use our vast corporate wealth to influence both public opinion and the candidates themselves. Our legal status as a corporate person now ensures our free speech and hence free spending. Next, we create the public illusion of competition and choice and gain as much control over the election process as possible. Our Demo-Publican pawns, with our endless sponsorship and lobbying, now handles this well, including the restriction of public debate and the denial of all interfering third parties. And if that wasn't enough, screw it. We'll just reorder the ballot counts ourselves with the black box voting hacks, in the most influential electoral states. And so it goes. You know, since the beginning of civilization, those in power have successfully restricted the interests of the majority by regulating their values, by controlling resources through money, not to mention controlling the very processes that exist to challenge them. Is it a conspiracy? Do such powerful men meet in dark rooms and work to figure out how to keep their power? Actually, no, not as much as you might think. You see, the hilarious thing about all of this is that such a process of manipulation is actually self-generating, justified in a step-by-step manner, with basic self-interest guiding the whole way. You see, the real corruption is not occurring in backroom meetings or at the docks. The real power resides in how you, the public, actually perpetuate, condone, and support the very underlying systems that oppress you. Final thoughts. Many watching this program's content will likely interpret the broad farce known as American democracy, or really the farce of global democracy, in fact, as a system in need of better regulation. The ACLU, Democracy Now!, Michael Moore, Occupy Wall Street, Annie Leonard, and other intelligent and outspoken activist institutions and figures seeking what they call change all actually operate within the same presupposition. If only we can better regulate monetary and corporate power, we can fix the world. No. I'm sorry to say that until the social premise itself, and hence the fundamental psychological drivers of our economy, imbalance, scarcity, narrow self-interest, exploitation and competition, until those are altered to the extent that the system begins to reward and reinforce collaboration, human and ecological balance, efficiency and sustainability, nothing is going to really change. In a sociological condition where everything is based on advantage over others, what we call corruption today isn't actually corruption at all. It's just business as usual. I mean, seriously, what did you people expect? In an economy where everything is for sale by the very ethic inherent, underscored by the false notion that we can't possibly work together intelligently to benefit all, no level of supposed corruption should surprise any of us. So, in short, to assume we're going to perpetuate this economic philosophy here and then contradict it over here with the idea that certain elements of society should be off limits from monetary manipulation and gain is completely naive and absurd. But don't take my word for it. Just sit back and watch the ebb and flow as we move from one set of corrupt, damaging practices to the next. Sure, we'll slowly fix a few issues with our in-the-box thinking, but until the whole system is addressed at its core, unfortunately, it's all mostly a waste of time, and improvement will be very, very little. And until we grow up to that level, sit back, relax, enjoy the show, and until next time, I'm Peter Joseph, an agent and victim of a culture in decline.
Modest preemptive actions can obviate the need of more drastic actions at a later date.
I think that you've been taught things like confidence intervals in an elementary statistical course that would let you do this, but if you really studied carefully, you'd know that they don't let you do this. A really principled frequentist can't produce a probability distribution.
The conclusion we want to point out when we think about valuation is the fact that means are scarce. I alluded to this already, that As finite beings, we can't will our ends to be attained.
Statistical description of the government's net of interest surplus.
Deflation, they think that yields could drop to, say, less than 1% on the 10 years and less than 2% on the 30 years.
That would effectively be a takeover of monetary policy by the Congress.
Daunting, right? Might even make you feel stupid. Perhaps it's no wonder then, while even with the ongoing economic failures across the world, inequality, increasing poverty, debt collapse, bank failures, unemployment rising, very few today seem to be able to understand, let alone discuss, modern economics. Outside, of course, the delegation game, where the only attempt at solutions people know is the mere shifting around of the deck chairs on the Titanic, assuming some new politician, central bank policy, or corporate legislation is going to save the day. Well, some years back, after coming to the conclusion that our politicians, legislators, and established authorities just might be provably incompetent when it comes to the truly intelligent management of our society, I started to look for questions and answers on my own. Asking those questions about things that many today either seem to take for granted, ignore, or even worse, assume that they have no capacity or business investigating at all, since our credentialed authorities in control must be smarter, more informed. It's a sad staple of modern culture, you know, the old relax, turn on the TV, keep going into debt, and pump out a bunch of kids while you're at it. But most importantly, keep showing up at those jobs, which you have likely already fooled yourself into believing serve some legitimate social role. Remember, the 1% of the world that owns 40% of the planet's wealth did not get that way with you understanding how the world really works. Nevertheless, and such cynicism aside, I decided that I needed to start again, if you will, and ask some fundamental questions about stuff most simply have written off and forgotten. If you were to take a poll today of our species, asking what truly are the most fundamental questions that pertain to human survival and prosperity, such as, what really supports human life, how food grows, what energy is, what creates and reinforces good public health, what defines a useful or detrimental belief system, you can rest assured that the vast majority would have more concrete answers about baseball statistics, fashion trends, sitcom plots, and religious scriptures. Not to demean the cultural pleasures and creativity of expression that creates enjoyment in this life, but we have a distortion of priority that has proven incredibly detrimental to the future of our sustainability on this planet, where the majority facing clear mounting problems not only doesn't understand what the root of such problems really are, they don't even know what questions to ask. And today there is no greater destructive ignorance at hand than the vastly delusional concept known as modern economics. And it is in this fundamental context that I found the most interest. So what is an economy? Where does its foundational premise come from? What are we relating to exactly? How is societal organization finding a benchmark for itself? Is there a benchmark? What are we doing? And why does the discussion of this subject appear to be so elitist in its vocabulary and orientation? Is it really that complicated? Well, I became so tired of being called ignorant of the subject by self-proclaimed experts I challenged, I decided to take it upon myself to read the entire macroeconomics curriculum of Harvard University from the undergraduate to the PhD level, along with all the staples of influence, F.A. Hayek, John Maynard Keynes, Ludwig von Mises. And I'll tell you what, I'm really glad I did, because I had some very poor judgments that needed correction. Not so much regarding my views about economics, but that life is short, and I wasted an enormous, unforgivable amount of time reading this outdated, overly intellectualized gibberish. Shit. Bob, would you take care of that, please? The fuse panel. Be careful, man, it's not grounded. As the following episode will detail, modern economics is not true economics at all. It's a mere ideological philosophy built upon a series of presuppositions that have been given the illusion of permanence. There is absolutely no relationship to the scientific integrity of our knowledge of the environment built into this model. The monetary market system of religious belief is at the core of the vast majority of ecological and social imbalance we see in the world today. Sadly, it is in the face of normality, so many look past it. We might begin to see that this principal notion and practice is truly a problem in society, and to me, it is at the heart of a culture in decline. Earth. Curious little ball of rock, gas, and water, isn't it? Hard to believe this little bubble of chemical elements floating in space, basically powered by the sun, could give rise to our colorful yet rather troubling super monkey species. A species often appearing pretty serious in its interest to destroy its habitat. Though I should say, pretty serious in its interest to destroy itself.
What is democracy?
It's got something to do with young men killing each other, I believe.
Excuse me a second. Bob, what the hell was that? The cutaway. It wasn't funny, it was just depressing. Couldn't you have found some guy shooting a bottle rocket out of his ass or something? I mean, you know what our demographic is and the point of this show, right? Okay, well, please. Anyway, perhaps our immaturity is just a phase, a tragically comedic rite of passage. No different than children that need to be burned by a hot stove in order to realize they shouldn't touch it, or what the physics behind it may be. Nevertheless, the history and characteristics of this little orb can be scientifically described with a good deal of accuracy. A couple billion years old now, a composite of gas and dust that resulted mostly from a large chemical reaction long ago, likely an exploding star or supernova. And over millions of years, this dust clustered into relatively big chunks of rock, a pronounced gravitational field emerged, our chemical elements were slowly reorganized, and conditions emerged to enable water and an atmosphere, which is what bred the first single-celled organisms. And so went the slow process of mutation into the very amusing circumstance we have today, us. Of course, you're free to believe whatever creation story you like, a rib from Adam, alien cross-pollination, primordial ooze. At the end of the day, the utility of such knowledge is quite small, and in fact, our little monkey brains might never have a complete picture of something so complex. Yet what we do know is that the universe is governed by laws, not moral or religious laws, but laws that were around long before we ever evolved a brain to understand them. Laws that very clearly point out that we either adapt to them and respect them, or we suffer the consequences. Such is the true face of God, the laws of nature. In many ways, the history of our universe is the history of our understanding of it. And we have come a long way as a species with respect to how we organize our lives around these rules. And likely the best example of this adaptation, or in many ways lack thereof, is how we think about economy, the foundation of our social survival. Many thousands of years ago, our super monkey brethren began to discover how to engage nature. We went from being completely at the mercy of the habitat, gathering our food with some hunting, living and migrating around the natural seasonal regeneration, to an agricultural revolution, learning how to cultivate food, create ever-sophisticated tools to ease labor, and, in effect, learn how to mimic nature itself. In fact, this new awareness and ever-increasing understanding to harness the processes of nature to our advantage is what has led to the vast technological innovation we see today. If nature is doing something, odds are we can understand how through these dynamic scientific principles. From artificial intelligence today, which works to emulate actual neurological processes, to molecular engineering, which uses the atomic logic to manually recreate material objects, to those now ever-important blood-shifting erectile dysfunction drugs, which, if you've been watching TV recently, must be the most epidemic health crisis in the Western world today. Since this revolution, human society became less nomadic, slowly merging into cities, and systems of labor specialization began to rise, along with means for exchange. Barter is a common example. You need some eggs? Maybe give some firewood you chopped up in exchange for the dairy farmer's work. Yet, such practices became cumbersome and impractical after a while, so the idea of using some rare, fancy rocks, like gold and silver, as a medium of exchange eased these transactions through a system of pricing goods in terms of their relative value. This gave birth to what we know today as the adjustable price system, which, through the public's aggregate patterns of exchange and production, creates a crude yet semi-workable logic where the prices of goods reflect the balance of supply and demand, otherwise known as the market or market value. Let me explain. When you stumble into the mall and buy the 85th generation iPoop 4G MP3 colostomy bag camera phone waffle maker, you are creating economic signal information that is used to calculate demand, local and regional preferences, and other resulting data in concert with the millions of other impulsive consumers who, having also likely bought the 84th generation just 2 months prior for twice the price, creates an aggregate flow of input data and feedback that allows for an ostensibly rational regulation of resource allocation, production, distribution, labor requirements, and of course, price consensus in the market based on perceived supply and demand. Not to mention the general data of how the marketing team can screw you over even more later on. This mechanism is partly what the ultimate high priest of our current economic religion, Adam Smith, was alluding to with his invisible hand notion of causality in the free market. And in many ways, he was onto something. It does work in a limited context in a crude way. In fact, in the 1920s, an economist named Ludwig von Mises put forward the still high-standing claim that without the price mechanism, economic calculation and rational resource allocation and general organization would be impossible. He called it the economic calculation problem. However, things are much different today than they were 200 years ago when Adam Smith published his Wealth of Nations or when Ludwig von Mises made his criticism of central planning. The fact is, the argument has changed. The economic debate now is what is actually sustainable and progressive for the human species, not the mere mechanics of the movement of money. While it is true the price system might allow for the basic calculation of supply and demand data to help rationally allocate labor, preference, distribution, and the like, it ignores the real operational factors that relate to true, efficient, earthly management, hence the true definition of economy, which is optimized efficiency on all levels. For instance, there is no consideration for optimum resource allocation based on the material's most efficient purpose. Rational allocation of resources is not rational if the most conducive use of those natural materials scientifically is not directly considered and brought into comparison. There is no consideration for the organizational efficiency of technical production itself. And all you have to do is analyze the waste machine of globalization to see this insanity at work. There is also no consideration for regeneration needs or recycling protocols, a true requirement for responsible, rational resource use on a finite planet. Nor is there any true production or distribution efficiency in any optimized scientific sense, as such a means is, as will be described more so in a moment, also counter to the inherent logic of the market system itself. These, coupled with many other serious parameters needed for a truly efficient economy, are simply ignored, or even worse, assumed to be inherent to the price mechanism's function when they clearly are not. You see, the price mechanism's concept of efficiency translates the subjective mass interaction of consumers into the narrow assessments of regional demand, production, and distribution. It has nothing to do with how or why the methods of industry are what they are. Such factors are left up to the whim of the producers, operating for profit alone, completely decoupling from the natural regulation of scientific principles of sustainability. Oh man. You see, at the core of the economic calculation problem is really the argument that we are completely irrational, that we can't possibly be organized in a way that is structurally efficient. We're too insane, essentially. Therefore, we have to have a general economic anarchy to organize our society, and there's no other way around it. Bullshit! Again, today is very different than it was prior, and a quick review of modern computer programming and systems engineering will tell you that not only can the algorithmic intelligence of our sensory and measurement technology today, coupled with synergistic computer calculation, orient all the previously existing factors taken into account by the price mechanism as we know it, the truly relevant yet missing factors for optimum efficiency and sustainability could be brought into the equation. This would be the making of a true economic calculation for industry, not the crude, truncated data put forward by price alone. So coming back to our household, the Earth, what is this thing really? It's a system. It's a system of symbiotic laws. And at the core of all principles of sustainability is recognition of the largest order system we can find for reference. The price mechanism on... Bob, what was that? Jesus Christ, Louis. Bob, why didn't you tell me Louis was here already? Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special guest here on Culture and Decline, our local guru, Louis the Logic Gremlin. Louis has a severe impatience for anything illogical, and he works to... Okay, Bob, you gotta get the goddamn demo publican back in his cage or Louis is gonna freak out. Oh, shit. Cut the camera. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. As I mentioned, Louis here gets a little frustrated when it comes to anything illogical, and the demo publican is sort of his mortal enemy. Anyway, Louis, since we have you here, I want to ask you a few questions. Is the free market actually a good basis for sustainability for the human species? Okay, yeah. Well, what about infinite wants and human needs? How do we calculate such complexity? Well, thank you very much, Louis. Appreciate that. Well, there you have it, folks. However, logic aside, opinions about our economic system range dramatically. So to gain some public consensus on the issue, we now go live to our New York Culture and Decline correspondent, Big Scotty D, who's live on Wall Street.
Thank you, Peter. This is Scotty D in front of the New York Stock Exchange. Today we're here in New York City just to try to talk to some people on the street and find out a little bit about what's going on in the world perception of economics.
Culture and Decline, man on the street.
So do you want to talk about the economy? Would you like to talk about the economy? Would you like to talk about the economy?
I really suck at this, but I don't think people want to talk about the economy either.
I just walked to my supermarket. He told me you can do that here.
Oh. However, there was one guy who was willing to talk to me. What do you feel is the definition of economics? Standing here in front of Wall Street, I'm just curious, what do you think economics is?
Well, I would say that economics is really it's just based on money, the things that go on from over here by Wall Street. It's just money that makes the system, generate throughout New York City or wherever in the world. But it's just mainly a money thing which make the world go around.
I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what is this guy talking about? But in reality, he probably knows as much about economics as I know about interviewing people on the street. And it seems like most of us really don't know what the economy is all about anyway. Back to you, Peter.
Man on the street.
Is it me, or have you noticed that there is more for sale in the world than ever before? And I'm not referring to goods in your local store. Today, the market rationale is that everything is for sale and nothing is sacred. Need some cash? Why don't you rent out your forehead to commercial advertising? Or better yet, why don't you buy the life insurance policy of your elderly neighbor, and when she dies, you can get a nice payout. Yup, it's legal. Or maybe it's the little things that make you happy. So rather than put that blow-up doll in your car to use the carpool lane, just buy it like you can in Minneapolis. Or maybe you have an itch to slaughter that endangered black rhino in Africa. Well, you can. Costs you about $150,000, but hey, it's there. 150, boy, I can't wait to eat that rhino. Or more seriously, maybe your kids are not excelling well at school. Well, the market has a solution. Pay them. Pay them to read and get good grades, like they do in Dallas, Texas. But perhaps that's overkill, because by the time they hit college age, most prestigious universities will look the other way for admission once a nice hefty donation is made for that new library wing. Want to serve your country but are tired of all those pesky UN war rules and poor pay? Just join the growing legion of private military contractors who are slowly replacing the US military in general. Or how about love? Need a date but don't want to wade through all the fog? Women will now go on dates with the highest bidder on some dating sites. Forget chatting, just fork out a couple $100 to entice the woman of your choice to allow you to pay for her dinner. I'm sure it will be a long-lasting relationship. Or perhaps most important, does your business need a law passed to secure profits? Well, just hire a lobbyist to influence Congress. As the prior episode of Culture in Decline denoted, there is nothing in the political and legal spectrum that is not clearly for sale. In fact, why do you think the court system allows most offenses to be cleared with monetary fines? But even if you do something really bad and you're stuck in jail, don't fret, because in some cases you can pay about $80 a night for a nice upgrade to a clean, quiet jail cell in the nice area of the prison. You name it, you can buy it, and nothing is sacred. 143 years after the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and 60 years after Article 4 of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights banned slavery and the slave trade worldwide, there are today more slaves than any time in human history, trafficking about 30 million for various profit schemes. But what about ethics, you might ask? Well, what about it? Ethics and morality continue to be redefined by the economic ethos of the day, and when a Wall Street trader makes millions of dollars betting against the currency and hence prosperity of another country, I can assure you he is sleeping like a baby at night. And why shouldn't he? He is simply doing what is rewarded and reinforced by the economic system at large. You see, the market's inherent psychology has nothing to do with anything except its own perpetuation. When you hear politicians tell you that they are invading some poor country to bring freedom and democracy, you need to understand what those words really imply. The freedom they bring is market freedom, and the democracy they bring is the democracy of purchasing power. The freedom of using money for influence, the freedom to, in fact, restrict the freedom of others. However, let's get back to this technical stuff. Putting aside the distortion of market rationale that now puts everything for sale, putting aside the false premise that the price mechanism actually properly calculates the true attributes of a sustainable and efficient economic practice, and putting aside the basic value system disorder radiating out of the overall basis of unfolding, let's now take a little quiz. Welcome to Modern Economics 101. Question 1. If you lived on a planet with finite resources and an expanding population, would you encourage an economy based on the need for growth and consumption to keep everything going? Correct answer? No. The fact that our economy literally requires constant consumption and growth to keep GDP afloat and people employed is the hallmark of not an economy, but an anti-economy. Question 2. If you were a producer, Would you make goods to be as durable and adaptable as possible given the finite nature of resources and an interest to maximize labor productivity? Answer, yes. Today, it's the opposite, and not only are all goods inferior the moment they are made due to the cost efficiency needs for corporations to remain competitive, most companies also engage in what is called planned obsolescence, which deliberately reduces good quality to encourage repeat purchases for more profit. Question 3. If you were a socioeconomic planner, would you encourage everyone to buy one of everything, hoarding that personal property protectively, even though many goods are used infrequently? Answer, no, that would be inefficient. The reality that goods are only as relevant as their use would be realized, and hence a system of shared access, not blind restrictive universal ownership, would be the most rational manner of unfolding. Question 4. What about incentive? Would you push a cutthroat competitive environment where everyone is out for themselves or their little group? Correct answer, no. Knowing what we know today about the competitive mentality and how it creates abuse, along with the reality that collaboration and the sharing of information is truly the driver of progress on the social level, competition would be seen as the most limiting of arrangements as a philosophical practice. And question 5. What would be the basis for reward today? Would you require every human to submit to each other for labor as to achieve the means for survival? No, that would be crude and counterproductive given the state of technology. Modern technical capacity has the ability to increase productivity beyond anything known in human history, not to mention secure more safety and efficiency in general. To push human labor for income in the face of this tool for vast improvement is just absurd. Final thoughts. If we were to take a step back and reflect upon how our human family is behaving across the world today, from Western materialism to Islamic extremism, from nuclear war to necrophilia, we are faced with a dark yet extremely entertaining reality. The very real fact that we are monkeys in the wild, barely out of the jungle on this planet, in the words of the late great George Carlin, inching out of the dark ages, in fact, from a period of deep fear and confusion with respect to who we are, what we're doing, how we relate to each other, not to mention how we relate to the habitat that spawned us. On one side of the spectrum, we have a vast spectacle of human conceit, stubborn ignorance, so much so that if you're like me, sometimes you wonder why we should try it all. That maybe this species deserves everything it gets, and its fate as an evolutionary cul-de-sac, a failed genetic mutation, might be an ideal hope for this universe. Cynicism aside, however, it's easy to see that there is a growing change in the minority, which will slowly become majority if we let it. An awakening is happening, an awakening where people have stopped imposing their traditional ideals and various ideological baggage on the world, and instead are starting to listening to what the tools of our ingenuity has afforded us, listening to the message of nature itself. And if there is any context which needs a serious intervention with respect to the natural laws that govern us, if there is any context where we need to simply pay attention, prepared to drop all of our prior assumptions and change accordingly, it is in the economic context. Economics is not just some arbitrary abstraction for processing and distributing resources. It is an underlying value molder that programs us into modes of behavior that extend into all areas of our psychology. It is the active global religion, whether people like it or not. And for those of us that wish to see reason triumph over dogma, we have a long, long road ahead. Advocates of the free market model of economics will tell you that there is no other system possible to calculate society, that the competitive basis is the only way to incentivize our primitive culture. They will tell you that reduced economic interference of government is the key to preserving the true integrity of the market economy and also preserve our so-called liberty, which they say would be quickly corrupted as tyranny and oppression must occur if any type of collaborative, designed economic practice was applied. They talk of the true free market, a utopian ideal that claims the invisible hand, if allowed to run without interference, would alleviate the poverty, deprivation, abuse, corruption, conflict, and inefficiency so common in the world today. Well, as with all religions, delusion is common. Because today the market is actually more free than ever, with the state being nothing more than a parent corporation working to assist its commercial subsidiaries which support it. Everything is for sale and no one is accountable. All natural laws and physical realities that would comprise the basis for true technical, earthly efficiency and awareness and reasoning that, if allowed, could literally transform the world into a place of vast abundance and prosperity never before seen, have been buried and dismissed, only to be overshadowed by a certain kind of efficiency, market efficiency, an efficiency that tracks money and money alone, an efficiency that is literally decoupled from everything that supports and secures life itself, an efficiency that is circular in its reasoning as it has no recognition of the physical laws of nature. The laws of nature, which are in fact the only real true government and regulatory system that has or will ever exist. But then again, who is to say it matters? Maybe we should all just take it in stride. Maybe this reality show of humankind, this satirical, tragic parody of itself, to be sure, doing all it knows, maybe this is the way it is, and our brains, our genes are messed up, and we're just waiting for the final laugh track when spaceship Earth slams into that psychological brick wall. I guess time will tell. And until then, sit back, grab some popcorn, and keep watching the greatest reality show of all time. And until next time, I'm Peter Joseph, an agent and victim of a culture in decline.
Would you like to talk about the economy?
Oh, hello. Hey, tell me honestly, do these pants make my ass look too big? Or wait, maybe not big enough. Is it time for a little butt cheek augmentation? Or maybe a little liposuction to take away these love handles at least. And perhaps while I'm at it, a nice tummy tuck. You know, that can't hurt to even it all out. But wait, why should I stop there? Since I'm a bit too lazy to work on these pecs, perhaps some implants might be in order. Along with a nice minor neck lift. Of course, I'm definitely going to have to do something about this male pattern baldness, right? What's that? An eyebrow lift? No, I don't know if I want to look all alert all the time. Rather, I think I'm going to finish off with a plethora of Botox injections that tighten up these wrinkles. You know, Botox, that chemical neurotoxin that temporarily paralyzes your nerves for the illusion of youthfulness. Marshall McLuhan once said that the last thing a fish would ever notice in its habitat is the water. Likewise, the most obvious and powerful realities of our human culture seem to also be the most unrecognized. And it is only when we take pause, often at the risk of social alienation, to question the foundational principles and ideas to which our lives are oriented, does a dark truth about our supposed normality become more clear. Today we live in an ocean with enormous waves of status obsession, materialism, vanity, ego, and consumerism. Our very lives have become defined not by our productive thoughts, social contributions, and goodwill, but by a superficial, delusional set of associations where the very fabric of our society now radiates with cheap romanticisms connected to vain competition, conspicuous consumption, and neurotic addictions, often related to physical beauty, status, and superficial wealth. In effect, social conformity masquerading as individualism, with the virtues of balance, intelligence, peace, public health, and true creativity left to rot on the sidelines. The cultural water we inhabit today runs deep with heavy pollution. It starts in our formative years, where to be smart and achieving is to be a nerd, a dweeb, or a geek, with social praise instead relegated to those of accepted appearance, wealth, and mindless brawn, reinforcing the idea that to think, know, and challenge is to be ridiculed, while to uphold the status quo, conform to the ideals imposed by society, is to be rewarded. At what point does that multi-billionaire with the 5 mansions go from being a peak icon of culturally accepted success to an example of a severe mental disorder, amounting to compulsive addiction, in fact, where the billionaire is revealed as nothing more than a social abomination in disguise by their decision to hoard such excessive levels of problem-solving wealth for no other utility than mere ego status. But then again, we can't be too hard on them, right? For what they're doing is simply what they've been taught. Just as the religions you believe or the gaming strategies you use for survival are groomed and cultivated by the environmental condition of your existence, so are the many other waves of influence in this ocean of memes that comprise the zeitgeist of the time. So maybe we should start to question what it is we are actually trying to accomplish rather than complain, and look at the social normalities of progress and success as they exist. And I don't know about you, but I'm beginning to suspect that the new commercial lifestyle that has been touted by economists and historians as some marvel of human social development is actually a hidden form of retardation. An unseen manifest value distortion that is making us sick, antisocial, increasingly vain, ecologically indifferent, and perhaps more and more malleable for the controlling factions of our society itself. Maybe, just maybe, our modern cultural strives for so-called success itself are in fact not symptoms of social progress at all, but symptoms of a culture in decline. A new disease has struck America, rapidly moving across the world. A disease largely unknown in earlier periods and almost entirely unnoticed by those who carry it. A disease spread not by a physical virus or genetic predisposition, but through cultural memes, ideas which are in fact infecting minds, growing and mutating in various strains, inhibiting the mental well-being of many. It's called CVD, Consumption Vanity Disorder. It's a plague of modern society which not only pollutes the minds and values of those infected, it is also turning our world into a cesspool of mini-malls and self-image disorders, wasteful materialism, and belligerent social transgressions.
So I've been working with these girls for a few years now. What many don't know about CVD is that many substrains or mutations have occurred. These women here suffer from HGS, or hot girl syndrome. So I see we have a few new faces here. Would anyone like to introduce themselves?
I moved to Los Angeles a couple of years ago, and I started noticing weird changes happening to my body. Like my skirt started getting shorter and shorter, and I started spending more and more on cosmetics and heels and like cheap jewelry. And then the Botox injection started. And I just couldn't stop. My lips got more and more pouty. And by the second or third buttock augmentation, I was looping DVD reruns of America's Next Top Model and Extreme Makeover 24/7, dating one hot football star douchebag after the other, and the next thing I knew, I was on the cover of Vogue.
It's okay, honey. I was on the cover of Vogue, too.
If we go back to the early 20th century, we find a critical crossroad for industry, where the rapid technological advancement was beginning to challenge the most basic foundation of traditional economics, and hence, social operation. You see, at the core of our socioeconomic system is labor and demand. Without product demand, of course, there is no need for production or employment. And without employment, the working public draws no income or purchasing power to buy the goods that keep the economy going. Early in the 1900s, a powerful expansion of productivity through machine application and mechanization brought about something industry really hadn't seen before: a goods surplus. A 1927 article in Nation's Business, conducting an interview with then Labor Secretary James Davis, stated, "It may be that the world's needs ultimately will be produced by 3 days' work a week." Years later, engineer R. Buckminster Fuller described the phenomenon as being able to accomplish more with less, in that the energy, manpower, and resources needed to accomplish particular goals was actually decreasing, while the accomplishments themselves were accelerating. In other words, industry was becoming more technically efficient. However, pre-20th century America and Western society in general maintained an ethic of being frugal overall. There was a conservative ethos where goods were obtained for their utility, a culture of needs, not excessive wants, and most people really didn't see the need to increase their consumption simply because they could. So, the ruling industrialists and social planners had a choice at this point. Either the system was to be adapted to this new more with less productivity, which could mean a rise in leisure time, a shortening of the work week, and an adjustment of pay scales and good values to reflect this newfound abundance as need be. Or, something more dramatic had to happen. The very underlying values and affections of the culture would need to be altered, where the very idea of consuming became a utility in and of itself, to consume for the sake of consuming, in order to maintain the status quo. Well, needless to say, given the very nature of capitalist philosophy, the latter... What's that? Oh, right. Well, needless to say, given the very nature of capitalist philosophy, the latter idea was deemed to be the only rational option. The current ruling ethic of ever-increasing profit and gain by industry could not be compromised. So the alternative idea of working toward an abundance to meet human needs, enabling perhaps a level of personal freedom never before seen, maybe even flourishing a new period of enlightenment for human existence, was rapidly cock-blocked by the interests of the ownership class. And the world you see around you, full of ever-increasing bullshit, vanity, materialism, waste, debt-locked wage slaves, conflict, and impulsive, mindless consumption has been the result.
The holiday shopping season got off to a violent start. A temporary Walmart worker was trampled to death by shoppers eager for post-Thanksgiving bargains.
The mad dash into a Walmart store knocked shoppers to the ground near Grand Rapids, Michigan at 5 in the morning. Despite several people falling to the ground, shoppers charged ahead.
Girl, push one of my kids out, we'll stab one of you mother...
Another incident here, a 28-year-old pregnant woman was knocked to the ground by that same crowd. Witnesses here at the scene say that woman actually suffered a miscarriage.
And in Southern California, shots rang out inside a crowded toy store.
You say that a woman sprayed fellow shoppers. This actually happened with pepper spray.
Meanwhile, those who knew DeMoore call his death senseless.
They act like animals. Just to buy something for $5, say $5, they actually murdered this guy.
How long have you been out here?
I've been out here 3 days.
In your own words, what brings you here?
TVs.
My kid wants what they wanted an iPad, I believe, the Samsung. But what happened was that they don't sell on that half price.
That's too bad. So, a lot of pushing and shoving happens in the stores. I remember seeing some stuff on the news. Have you ever had that experience before?
Not on Black Friday at a music concert, but I know how it feels, so I'm prepared.
So you're ready to push people back?
Pretty much.
What do you think of this kind of like impulsive sort of consumerism that gets really forceful sometimes?
I don't know. I feel like it's going to be a lot of stress for everybody.
Meet Eddie Bernays. He is considered the father of modern advertising, most famous for turning the largely abhorred word propaganda into the fluffy, warm euphemism public relations. Bernays haphazardly took popular ideas from Freudian psychoanalysis and began to apply them to advertising campaigns. The idea was simple: link and exploit the very primitive social urges common to most humans, such as sexuality and status, to a product.
Seems so much longer than last year.
It is. Nearly 4 inches longer in some models.
Oh.
Goods were to become less relevant in their utility and more of a symbol representing one's identity or individualism, effectively turning mere wants into emotional needs. Bernays was a response to a growing call by industrial leaders to reprogram society and create a new consumer culture. Charles Kettering, director of General Motors in 1929, wrote of the need to keep the consumer dissatisfied. Wall Street banker Paul Mazur said, "We must shift America from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want things even before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America." And it worked. Technological innovation in radio and television helped further this end by a saturation campaign throughout American society, which quickly spread across the world. Advertising no longer was about describing, say, the function of a good and its inherent integrity. It was now about social manipulation, creating inferiority, shame, guilt, and false problems that could only be resolved by submission to purchase.
Over an 80-year lifespan, we watch 15 and a half years of television on average. 15 and a half years of having our brains liquefied and sodomized, zombified, and then glorifying products and nonsense. And that screws with us, because advertisements are assholes. They're assholes. Imagine if an advertisement were just a regular guy walking up to you on the street, just going, "Hey, hey you, hey, hey, if you wore these jeans, then the hot girls would really do you." I mean like hot girls, not that ugly broad you call a girlfriend. And by the way, could you mention to her that she needs to lose a little weight and do something about her hair? And she could do it too if she would just use these diet pills and this hair gel. And by the way, both of you guys should probably be smoking these cigarettes and drinking this beer. Then you'd be really cool. Although your teeth are looking a little yellow, but we can fix that if you would just use this tooth whitening shit. And then the hot girls would really do you. And by the way, are you happy with your penis size? If you are, that's cool. A lot of guys are happy with fun size. Is that what you call that, fun size? A lot of girls like that. I mean, I haven't met any, but I bet there are some. But if you change your mind, all you'd have to do is take a couple of these babies, and soon you would have to call up guys to help you carry your junk around like a train on a wedding dress. But how are you gonna call your junk carriers with that crappy phone you got there? You should be using this phone with the swipey bullshit technology that makes other people feel like they're better than you just by owning this phone. And they are better than you. Oh my God, all this stuff you need and don't have is making me anxious. Is it making you anxious? Is it? Is it? Is it? Are you anxious now? Are you? Are you? Are you? Well, then all you'd have to do is take a couple of these, and in 2 weeks' time, you would feel better than anything. Plus, bonus side effect, these pills also make your ass hair shiny and more manageable with extra bounce. Anyway, I gotta go, because your girlfriend just decided she looks pretty good in a vintage dress, and I gotta turn that around quick before she stops taking the Ambien Prozac cocktail I gave her, and then she'll stop shopping continuously in order to fill the void created by self-hatred, created by me. Would you hang out with that guy?
You see, at the core of advertising is the exploitation of our deep social nature. It turns the empathic community identification into a weapon of external judgment and relative insecurity. In fact, some years back, a multi-year study where Western television was brought into a culture which had never experienced it before was conducted on the island of Fiji. By the end of the observation period, the effect of materialistic values and vanity took a powerful toll. A relevant percentage of young women, for example, who prior had embraced a style of healthy weight and full features, became obsessed with being thin. Eating disorders, which were virtually unheard of in this culture, began to spread, and women specifically were transformed. But let's return to our history lesson. This vanity, materialism, and obsessive consumption neuroses, as powerful as it is, was not quite enough to ensure the stability of the capitalist religion and the ongoing benefit to the ownership class priests. The engineering of consent through advertising aside, the technological age brought another nasty problem for business: increased product efficiency. Not only was production moving faster than traditional consumption, the actual quality of individual goods were increasing as well, due to scientific advancements in design, making needed repeat purchases increasingly less common. Well, this was no good. Remember, the core driver of labor, profit, and consumption, hence the core driver of our economy in general, is scarcity and inefficiency. In fact, the enemy of the market economy has always been competency, and the better and long-lasting a good is, the worse it is for industry. So the water broke and planned obsolescence was born. In 1932, industrialist Bernard London propagated a pamphlet entitled "Ending the Depression Through Planned Obsolescence," where the idea of universally making poor goods to generate more labor demand and growth seemed logical. Some even wanted to make it mandatory for all industries, legally, where life cycles were decided not by the natural state of technological ability, but by the mere ongoing need for labor and increased consumption. In fact, the most notable historical example of this period was the Phoebus light bulb cartel of the 1930s, where in a time where light bulbs were able to last up to about 25,000 hours, the cartel forced each company to restrict light bulb life to a mere 1,000 hours to assure repeat purchases. And in time, this eventually became the strategic approach for all industries. And if you were to sit down and compare the true efficiency possible today to what we're actually doing to keep this waste and deprivation machine going, you would puke in your soup at the lost possibilities. And the final component to note here relates to the problem of purchasing power itself. A fail-safe was needed to ensure monetary circulation and so-called growth, even if the purchasing parties didn't have it. Well, welcome to credit expansion. Credit access has been, in reality, the core driver of economic growth in the West for a very long time. And a quick glance at the private and public debt today globally shows that it is not an anomaly for a person or country to live far beyond its financial means. It is indeed the set fashion. The amount of debt existing globally today far exceeds the entire global money supply itself, and it has been this borrowing from nowhere that has compensated for the inherent limits of employment and wages. However, as bothersome as all of this may seem with respect to ecological irresponsibility and cultural neuroses, the rabbit hole runs deeper. We often forget that the undercurrent of the last couple thousand years has been that some in our species are apparently more deserving than others, and the slavery, exploitation, and ensured deprivation of one group for the advantage of another was considered some law of nature. During feudalism of the Middle Ages, social divisions were clearly defined, with the king and his nobles and barons, etc., holding control of the legion of serfs who were essentially slaves in exchange for basic resources and moderate protection. A common theme during this period was that a genetic or religious superiority of the kings and his constituents gave them the right to dominate. However, as feudalism inched into state monopoly mercantilism and then into open market capitalism, the view of the average peasant laborer, or working class wage slave as they exist today, mutated to where whatever minor protections existed prior was removed to support a doctrine where if a person is not able to obtain work in the market economy, their right to life or mere existence is completely without security. Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Thomas Malthus, and other pivotal figures of the dawn of modern capitalism make it very clear that the system they advocate is not for everyone. It isn't as though they actually wanted it that way. They weren't Nazis or anything. But when you consider the scarcity-driven world which they lived, it did seem natural enough. Adam Smith, observing the nature of a social order defined by property relations, stated, "Civil government, so far as it is instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor, or of those who have some property against those who have none at all." David Ricardo, building on Smith's invisible hand, pseudo-Darwinistic view of market survival, extended the notion to where the inevitable poverty and deprivation of the poor was to be a societal law of nature like gravity, with Malthus going so far to say that you only do harm to the poor by trying to help them. He stated, "Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague." Of course, many hearing such rhetoric today naturally react in apprehension, not understanding the source of such cold perspectives. Again, if we went back to pre-industrial Europe and witnessed the vast imbalance, scarcity, and poverty, perhaps in fact due to population outpacing production capacity, your intuition might draw the conclusion that the carrying capacity of the land simply can't handle the current population. You might also then come up with some very convenient justifications as to why some are to live and prosper and some are to die and be deprived, why some deserve a great deal of wealth and honor, and while others must be condemned to destitution and subsistence. So it is very easy to see how this classism has held strong, even though its counterparts of racism and sexism have slowly subsided in modern culture. Today, all economic schools of thought, from Keynesian to Austrian, support a will of the market theme, where your value is measured not by the fact that you exist as a human being, but by the place you hold or don't hold in the economic machine. Consider this quote by Ricardo. "By gradually contracting the sphere of the poor laws, by impressing on the poor the value of independence, by teaching them that they must not look to systematic or causal charity, but to their own exertions for support, that prudence and forethought are neither unnecessary nor unprofitable virtues, we shall by degrees approach a sounder and more healthful state." You see, the myth of this system is that people get what they work for, as though it's a level playing field, as though the competitive nature doesn't inherently breed corruption. Wrong! Oh, man. Bob, what's he doing here? So what kind of bullshit is Peter Joseph Stalin feeding you people this episode? Listen, man. Listen, people. What Captain Freedom Hater over here doesn't seem to understand is that the poor are fucking stupid. They're stupid and lazy, and they get what they deserve, all right? And I'm so sick of the nanny state coming in and taxing my hard-earned trust fund so these cretins can go and live it up with their lottery tickets and their malt liquor. Sorry, Bob. You all right? Put him back in his cage. Now, it is at this point you might be asking, what does any of this have to do with consumerism? Well, if you understand the traditional ethos of market capitalism and how it refuses to accept the possibility of taking care of everyone, coupled with the resulting delusion that those who do end up benefiting most must be smarter and more worthy of existence than others, as though it's some law of nature, the role of consumer culture today takes on a very different purpose. It exists as a powerful means of social control and maintaining the status quo of class division and subjugation. It helps perpetuate a trend that has been around for a long time, since the age of ordained kings, who were destined to rule over and exploit the weak masses. You see, the individualistic material selfishness glorified today not only perfectly accentuates the classic economic values of Ricardo and Smith, it also reinforces modern neoliberalism, where the view of detached, independent, narrow self-interest and narcissism is held as deeply sacred, while any attempt at working towards a broad social consideration, working towards a community environment, is heretical. Simultaneously, it compounds class division, since the consumer culture has created an abstract sense of competition and status where to have more than others is equated to success. Suddenly, 1% of the population owning 40% of the planet's wealth is even more vindicated. along with how one can step over homeless people on the street and assume that they must be that way because of their own lack of initiative, laziness, or general inferiority. Modern consumer culture, the consumer vanity disease, ensures that the public remain distracted and at war with itself. It ensures that profits from these wasteful and unnecessary purchases, driven by emotional dissatisfaction, will continue to perpetuate and justify the wealthy elite. And it ensures that the poor and miserable of the world will be kept in their place, because guess what? It must be some law of nature. Final thoughts. Likely the most hijacked and delusional concept in the world today is that of freedom. In political poetics, historically, it went from a general interest to ensure quality of life and remove oppression, really, to a marketing gimmick to sell you things you don't need to ensure the integrity of an inherently elitist, corrupt political economy. I don't know about you, but I really don't give much of a shit about how many different kinds of toothpaste or deodorant I can choose from in a grocery store. While I'm given simultaneously the farce choice between two politicians clearly of the same breed in an election. I really don't care much for the freedom of being able to concoct, say, a grande white mocha double espresso non-fat steamed milk stirred unsweetened caffeine-free jerk me off slap my ass latte with extra whip at Starbucks. You see, the best form of social control is the kind where the illusion of choice actually persists, and the consumer vanity obsession rampant across the world now embodies the new form of democracy. Forget about the oligarchical plutocracy that continues to rule and destroy the world. Just focus on the rich celebrities on the cover of that goods catalog masquerading as a literary magazine. Forget about how financial and monetary gain is a measure of success and how delusional it really is, for the psychological phenomenon of relative deprivation has shown that having more and more luxury often does not make you happy, only more neurotic, insecure, and antisocial. Forget about the ever-increasing use of antidepressants and other mental health disorders that have emerged around our material society, and do what many do instead. Go shopping! Today, the act of shopping really has become a form of therapy for people if you're paying attention, an artificial means to feel better about oneself. And forget about the reality that the greatest lie behind the political system is that there can exist political equality in the wake of perpetual economic inequality. The fact is, the toxic condition that we've created around this new materialistic freedom is at the root of the vast waste of not only the Earth's resources, but the vast waste of human potential and human integrity itself. The more you own, the more you're owned. And as an aside, everyone's beautiful when they smile. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I'm late for my pedicure. So until next time, keep those eyes glued to the worst yet greatest reality show of all time. My name is Peter Joseph, and I, like you, am an agent and victim of a culture in decline.
So given the trials you all experience in your day-to-day coping with this disease, how has it affected your livelihood? Why don't we start with you? What are you doing for work?
Porn. Porn. Victoria's Secret model. Porn. Louis Vuitton model. Porn.
Guest model.
Porn.
American Apparel model. Okay, porn.